The rain hammered down on the cracked pavement of downtown Portland, Oregon, as Sarah Mitchell clutched her 6-year-old son closer beneath the tattered blanket that served as their only shelter. It was November 14th, 2023, and the 42-year-old woman had just received a letter that would change everything, though not in the way she could have ever imagined. Seems impossible, doesn't it? A homeless woman inheriting property. But this story happened right here in America, in our own time, and what Sarah found on that abandoned farm would shake everyone who heard about it. Before we continue, tell me what city you're listening from in the comments. I love knowing where you all are when you hear these stories, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, go ahead and subscribe now so you don't miss what happens next. Portland in 2023 was a city of stark contrasts. While tech workers sipped $7 lattes in trendy cafes, people like Sarah Mitchell huddled in doorways, invisible to most passers-by. The economic recovery everyone talked about on the news hadn't reached the streets where she and her son, Tommy, spent their nights. Sarah had once been a retail manager, a woman with an apartment and a future. But a series of devastating events, a layoff during the pandemic, medical bills from Tommy's asthma treatments, and an abusive relationship she'd barely escaped, had sent her spiraling downward. By the time she hit rock bottom, she'd lost everything. Her job, her home, her savings, and her dignity. The shelters were always full. The waiting lists stretched for months. Social services had become a labyrinth of paperwork and broken promises. Sarah had learned to survive on the streets, to know which alleys were safer, which dumpsters behind which restaurants had the freshest discarded food, which park bathrooms stayed unlocked after dark. She was 42 years old, but the streets had aged her beyond her years. Her once brown hair was now streaked with premature grey, pulled back in a permanent ponytail held together with a rubber band she'd found. Her hands were calloused and cracked from constant exposure to the elements. Her face bore the marks of sleepless nights and constant worry, deep lines around her eyes, a tightness around her mouth that never quite relaxed. Tommy was her reason for continuing. Every morning she made sure he got to school, even if it meant walking him 3 miles across town. She kept his clothes as clean as possible, washing them in public restrooms. She saved every bit of food for him, often going hungry herself. At 6 years old, he was small for his age, with his mother's dark eyes and a resilience that broke Sarah's heart. He deserved so much better. Sarah Mitchell hadn't always been homeless. She'd grown up in a modest home in Spokane, Washington, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. Her mother, Grace, had died when Sarah was just 19, leaving her alone in the world. There had been no other family, no aunts, uncles, or cousins that she knew of. Her father had left before she was born, a ghost she'd never met. She'd worked her way through community college, gotten that retail management job, and built a life. Then she'd met Derek, a charming man who'd slowly revealed himself to be controlling and violent. By the time she'd gotten pregnant with Tommy, she was trapped. It took 3 years to gather the courage to leave, and when she did, Derek had made sure she lost everything. The pandemic had finished what Derek started. Her job disappeared. Her apartment went next. The system that was supposed to help became an obstacle course of bureaucracy. And suddenly, she and Tommy were on the streets. 2 more invisible casualties in America's homelessness crisis. She'd tried everything. She'd applied for hundreds of jobs, but who wants to hire someone with a P.O. box address and no phone? She'd gone to every agency, filled out every form, but the help never quite materialized. She'd thought about giving Tommy up, letting him go to foster care where he'd at least have a bed and regular meals, but every time she considered it, she couldn't do it. He was all she had. She was all he had. And then, on that rainy November morning, a man in a grey suit had found her in her usual spot near the Burnside Bridge. "Sarah Mitchell?" he'd asked, holding a briefcase above his head to shield himself from the rain. She'd nodded warily, pulling Tommy behind her. Men in suits usually meant trouble, social services threatening to take Tommy, or worse. "My name is Robert Harrison. I'm an attorney," He'd handed her a business card that immediately got soaked. "I've been looking for you for 3 months. It's about your uncle, Vernon Mitchell." Sarah had stared at him blankly. "I don't have an uncle." "You did," the lawyer said gently. "Your father's brother. He passed away 6 months ago in rural Montana. He left his property to you, his only living relative." 3 days later, Sarah and Tommy stood in Robert Harrison's office in downtown Portland, still hardly believing what was happening. The lawyer had paid for them to stay in a motel for 2 nights, the first real beds they'd slept in for over a year. He'd arranged for them to shower, had taken them to get some clean clothes from a thrift store, and had even bought Tommy a hot meal that made the boy's eyes light up. Now, as rain pelted the windows of the 20th floor office, Harrison spread out papers across his desk. "Your Uncle Vernon was a difficult man," Harrison began carefully. "He lived alone on a 160-acre farm outside of Billings, Montana. He had no wife, no children. When he died, it took us months to track down any living relatives. Your father, his brother James, had passed away years ago. We found the death certificate. That made you his only heir." "I never even knew he existed," Sarah said, her voice hoarse. She was sitting on the edge of her chair, Tommy pressed against her side. The office felt surreal. The plush carpet, the leather chairs, the view of the city below. It was a world she'd forgotten existed. From what I understand, there was a falling out between the brothers decades ago. Vernon moved to Montana in 1985 and never spoke to the family again. Harrison pulled out more documents. "The property is... well, it's in poor condition. The house hasn't been maintained in years. Vernon was something of a recluse, but it's yours, free and clear. No mortgage, no liens." He slid a photograph across the desk. Sarah picked it up with trembling hands. It showed a weathered 2-story farmhouse, white paint peeling, surrounded by overgrown fields. A large barn listed to one side in the background. Mountains rose in the distance. "There's no electricity currently," Harrison continued. "The water comes from a well that may or may not still work. The nearest town, Laurel, is about 15 miles away. It's very isolated." He paused. "Ms. Mitchell, I have to be honest with you. This property isn't worth much in its current state. You could probably sell it for $40,000 or $50,000 if you're patient. That would be enough to get you and your son into an apartment, get you back on your feet." Sarah stared at the photograph. $40,000 sounded like a fortune, but she knew how quickly money could disappear. First and last month's rent, deposits, furniture, clothes, all the things they'd need. And what would she do after that? She had no job, no references, no way to earn money. "What if we went there?" she asked quietly. "To the farm?" Harrison looked surprised. "Ms. Mitchell, I don't think you understand how remote it is. There's no infrastructure, no services nearby. Winter's coming. It would be incredibly difficult." "Difficult?" Sarah almost laughed, a bitter sound. "Mr. Harrison, my son and I have been sleeping in doorways for 14 months. We've gone days without eating. Last week someone tried to steal the blanket we were sleeping under. Difficult is relative." The lawyer studied her for a long moment. "There is a trust fund," he said finally. "Small, about $8,000. Vernon set it aside specifically for property maintenance or taxes. I can release that to you if you decide to go to the farm. It would be enough to buy supplies, get the utilities turned back on, maybe make some basic repairs." Tommy tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Mom, can we have our own house?" His voice was small, hopeful. Sarah looked down at her son, then back at the photograph of the ramshackle farmhouse in Montana. It wasn't much. It might be a disaster, but it was a chance. Maybe the only one they'd get. "When can we leave?" she asked. 5 days later, Sarah steered the ancient pickup truck she'd bought for $1,200 off the highway and onto a rutted dirt road. The GPS on the lawyer's borrowed phone, which he'd insisted she take, showed they were 3 miles from the property. The November landscape was bleak, all brown grass and grey sky, with snow-capped mountains looming in the distance. Tommy sat in the passenger seat, bundled in the warmest coat they'd been able to find at Goodwill. He'd been quiet for most of the 13-hour drive from Portland, watching the landscape change from wet green forests to dry eastern plains. "Is that it, Mom?" he asked as a house came into view. Sarah's heart sank. The photograph hadn't done justice to how bad it really was. The farmhouse stood isolated in the middle of empty fields, its white paint almost completely stripped away by wind and weather, leaving grey, weathered wood exposed. Several windows were broken, covered with pieces of plywood. The porch sagged dangerously on one side. The roof showed patches of missing shingles. The barn behind it looked even worse, its door hanging open, revealing darkness inside. But there were no other houses visible in any direction, no neighbors, no traffic sounds, just wind whispering through dead grass and the cry of a hawk circling overhead. Privacy, space, shelter. Sarah pulled up in front of the house and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. "It needs work," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "But it's ours, Tommy. No one can kick us out. No one can make us leave." She found the keys in the manila envelope Harrison had given her and approached the front door. Her hands were shaking as she fitted the key into the lock. It turned with a reluctant squeal, and the door swung open. The smell hit her first, dust, mildew, and something else she couldn't identify. Abandonment. Death, maybe. She stepped inside, Tommy close behind her. The interior was dim, most of the windows still covered or too dirty to let in much light. But as her eyes adjusted, Sarah could make out a living room with old furniture covered in dust and sheets. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. To the right, an archway led to what looked like a kitchen. A staircase climbed up the left wall to the second floor. "Stay close to me," Sarah warned Tommy as they explored. The floorboards creaked ominously under their feet. In the kitchen they found an ancient gas stove, a cast-iron sink, and cabinets that stuck when she tried to open them. Upstairs, there were 4 bedrooms, all empty except for old bed frames and more dust. But the house had good bones. The walls were solid. The roof had holes, but they could be patched. The stone foundation looked intact. In one of the bedrooms, Sarah found the first real evidence that someone had once lived here. A dresser stood against the wall, and when she opened the top drawer, she found it full of papers, old bills, receipts, letters. On top of the dresser sat a framed photograph of 2 men in their 20s, arms around each other, grinning at the camera. She picked it up, studying their faces. One of them had to be Vernon, which meant the other was probably her father, James, a man she'd never known. "Mom, I'm cold," Tommy said, breaking into her thoughts. Sarah looked around the bare room and made a decision. "We'll sleep in the truck tonight," she said. "Tomorrow we'll start working on the house, but first thing, we need to get some heat." They spent that first night huddled together in the truck cab, the heater running, going through the supplies they'd bought before leaving Portland. Canned food, bottled water, blankets, basic tools. Sarah had spent the trust fund money carefully, knowing it had to last. She'd bought a generator, fuel, a chainsaw, nails, plywood, and warm clothes. Everything else would have to wait. As Tommy finally fell asleep against her shoulder, Sarah stared out at the dark shape of the farmhouse and wondered what the hell she'd gotten them into. The first week was brutal. Sarah woke each morning before dawn, her body aching from sleeping cramped in the truck. While Tommy slept, she'd work on the house, starting with the basics, covering broken windows with plywood, clearing debris, sweeping out years of accumulated dust and mouse droppings. The well still worked, which felt like a miracle, though the water ran rust-brown for the first 15 minutes until the pipes cleared. She got the generator running and was able to power a few lights and the old refrigerator in the kitchen, which sputtered to life reluctantly. The gas furnace was another story. It needed repairs she didn't know how to make, so she spent hours gathering fallen branches from the windbreak trees that lined one side of the property, chopping them into firewood with the chainsaw, building fires in the stone fireplace that at least kept one room warm. Tommy helped as much as a 6-year-old could, carrying small pieces of wood, handing her tools, sweeping. She enrolled him in the elementary school in Laurel, which meant a 30-mile round trip each day in the truck, but at least there he got breakfast and lunch, and she didn't have to worry about him being hurt while she worked on dangerous repairs. She discovered that the barn, despite its appearance, was actually more sound than the house. It had a concrete floor and solid walls, and after she cleared out years of junk, old farm equipment, rotting hay, rusted tools, it became a decent workspace. She found valuable things too, a set of still functional hand tools, copper wire she could sell for scrap, an old wood stove that just needed cleaning. Money was running out fast. The trust fund was nearly gone, spent on fuel for the generator and truck, food and emergency supplies. Sarah knew she needed to figure out how to earn money, but what could she do out here? She had no internet, no way to look for remote work. The nearest town was tiny, with few jobs available, and she had no childcare. She started selling things on Craigslist in Billings, 30 miles away. The copper wire, some old farm equipment, even furniture from the house she didn't need. It brought in a few $100s, enough to buy more food, but it wasn't sustainable. At night, after Tommy was asleep in the one bedroom she'd made livable upstairs, Sarah would sit by the fire and try not to panic. She'd escaped homelessness, yes, but she traded it for isolation and uncertainty. The house needed tens of thousands of dollars in repairs. Winter was coming. She had maybe $500 left. She was 42 years old, alone, and running out of options again. It was during the second week, while clearing out the last corner of the barn, that Sarah made the first discovery. She was pulling out rotted lumber from what had been a storage area when her hand struck something solid, a metal container hidden behind the wood. She pulled it free and carried it into the light. It was an old army surplus box, the kind designed to be waterproof and dustproof, about 2 feet long and a foot wide. The latches were rusted but still functional. Sarah's heart pounded as she worked them open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were bundles of cash. Sarah gasped, her hands shaking as she pulled out the bundles. Hundreds of bills, all old, 20s, 50s, hundreds. She counted quickly, losing track, counting again. Approximately $12,000. She sat back on the cold concrete floor, staring at the money spread out around her. Her mind raced. Where had this come from? Why had Vernon hidden it? Was it legal? And then, underneath the money, she found a notebook. It was leather-bound, old, the pages yellowed, but the handwriting still clear. She opened it to the first page. Property records, Vernon Mitchell. Started 1985. She flipped through the pages, seeing entries that tracked work done on the farm, expenses, notes about crops planted and harvested. But about halfway through, the entries changed. They became about something else entirely. April 12, 1998, found old foundation near North Property Line. Started investigating. May 3rd, 1998, definitely not a barn foundation. Too large. Stone construction. Underground chamber. June 15th, 1998, broke through. It's real, can't believe it. Need to be careful. Can't let anyone know. The entries continued, growing more detailed, more excited. Vernon had found something on the property, some kind of underground structure. He'd spent years investigating it, clearing it out, documenting what he found. And the final entry dated just 3 months before his death. Getting too old for this. Body won't let me go down anymore. But it's all still there. Everything I found. Maybe someday someone will care. Maybe they'll do what I was too afraid to do. GPS coordinates 45.8234 degree N, 108.5177 degree W. Sarah grabbed her phone and punched in the coordinates. The GPS showed a location on this property, about half a mile north, near a cluster of old cottonwood trees she'd noticed at the edge of what had once been a wheat field. She should wait. She should think this through. She should be cautious. But Sarah Mitchell had spent 14 months on the streets with her son. She'd lost everything once and clawed her way to this small piece of security. If there was something on this property, something valuable, something that could ensure Tommy's future, she had to know. She grabbed a flashlight, the notebook, and a shovel from the barn. Then she started walking north through the dead grass, following the GPS coordinates, her heart hammering in her chest. The cottonwood trees stood like sentinels around a small clearing. In the center, hidden by tall grass and decades of neglect, Sarah found it, a slight depression in the earth, and at its center, half buried in soil and vegetation, the edge of a stone structure. She began digging, pulling away grass and dirt, revealing more of the stonework. It was clearly very old, the stones carefully fitted together with mortar that had long since crumbled in places. After an hour of work, she'd exposed what looked like an entrance, a rectangular opening about 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, currently filled with more dirt and debris. Sarah's phone buzzed. She'd lost track of time. She had to pick up Tommy from school in 20 minutes. She covered the entrance as best she could, marking its location carefully, then ran back to the house. All through the drive to school and back, through making dinner for Tommy, through helping him with his homework by flashlight, her mind raced. What had Vernon found? Why had he kept it secret? After Tommy was asleep, she sat by the fire and read through the entire notebook again, more carefully this time. Vernon had been methodical, documenting everything. He'd discovered the underground structure in 1998, 27 years ago. It had taken him months to clear the entrance. Inside he'd found chambers, that was the word he used, chambers, that contained artifacts. He'd listed them, pottery, tools, what he believed were ceremonial objects. He thought it was a Native American site, possibly centuries old, but he'd been afraid to report it. Afraid the government would take the property, or archaeologists would descend and he'd lose his privacy, or worse, that he'd be accused of looting or destruction if he'd damaged anything. So he'd kept it secret, visiting the chambers occasionally, adding to his records, but telling no one. The money in the barn had come from selling a few small artifacts to private collectors over the years, something he'd felt guilty about, based on his notes, but had done because he needed the income. Sarah sat staring at the fire long after it burned down to embers. She'd stumbled into something significant, potentially very significant, but she had no idea what to do about it. Over the next week, Sarah worked frantically to clear the entrance to the underground structure. She couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery might be her answer, a way to secure their future, but she also knew she had to be careful. Vernon's caution made sense. If this was a protected archaeological site, she could lose everything. She worked only when Tommy was at school, making steady progress. The entrance led to a sloping passage, the walls lined with carefully fitted stones. She had to clear away decades of accumulated dirt and debris, working by flashlight, her claustrophobia fighting with her determination. And then, finally, she broke through into the first chamber. Sarah stood in a space about 20 feet across, her flashlight beam playing across walls, covered in faded but still visible paintings, geometric patterns, animal figures, symbols she didn't recognize. Stone shelves lined the walls, and on them sat dozens of pottery vessels, some broken, some intact. In the center of the room, a fire pit, long cold, still contained ashes. She moved deeper, finding more chambers branching off the first. In one, she found what looked like burial niches carved into the rock. In another, more pottery, along with tools, stone knives, scrapers, grinding stones. Everything was covered in dust, untouched for what might be centuries, except for Vernon's careful investigations. Sarah sat down in the main chamber, overwhelmed. This was significant, this was history, but it was also on her property, hidden, secret. And she had no idea what the legal implications were. She thought about her situation. $500 left, no income, winter coming, a son depending on her, a house that needed repair. She could report this discovery, do the right thing, and probably lose everything in the process. Archaeologists would take over, the government would get involved, and she and Tommy would be right back where they started. Or she could do what Vernon had done, keep the secret, at least for now, not disturb anything, not sell anything, just keep it quiet until she was more stable, until she could afford good legal advice, until Tommy was secure. It wasn't really a choice. The next 2 months passed in a blur of survival and slow improvement. Sarah continued making repairs to the house, prioritizing the ones that would help them survive winter. She got the furnace partially working, enough to heat 2 rooms. She patched the worst holes in the roof. She insulated the bedroom where she and Tommy slept. The hidden cash from the barn helped immensely. She was able to buy supplies, pay for heating oil, and even purchase some basic furniture. She started a small side business, doing odd jobs in Laurel. House cleaning, yard work, anything that let her bring Tommy along. The money was small but steady. Tommy thrived with the stability. He made friends at school. His asthma got better with regular meals and a warm place to sleep. He loved the open space, the ability to run and play without fear. Sarah watched him bloom and felt vindicated in her decision to come to Montana. But the secret chambers weighed on her. She visited them once a week, documenting what she found, taking photographs with her phone, being careful not to disturb anything. She researched during her rare trips to the library in Billings, learning about the indigenous peoples who'd lived in this region, the Crow, the Cheyenne, others whose names had been lost to history. She wondered if the chambers were a refuge, a ceremonial site, or something else entirely. And she wondered what would happen when, not if, but when the secret eventually came out. The answer came in February, in the most unexpected way. Sarah was in town picking up supplies when a woman approached her in the hardware store parking lot. She was Native American, probably in her 50s, with long grey-streaked hair and a weathered face that reminded Sarah of the land itself. "You're the woman who inherited Vernon Mitchell's place," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Sarah tensed. "Yes, my name is Elizabeth Crow. My people are from here, Crow Nation. Vernon Mitchell and I had an arrangement." She glanced around the parking lot, then back at Sarah. "Can we talk somewhere private?" They ended up at a small diner on the edge of town, Tommy coloring at the end of the booth, while the 2 women talked in low voices over coffee. "Vernon was a strange man," Elizabeth said. "Private, but he wasn't a bad man. 20 years ago he came to me because he knew I was involved in cultural preservation work. He told me what he'd found on his property." Sarah's heart raced. "You know about the chambers. I've known for 2 decades. Vernon made me promise not to tell anyone, not the tribe, not the government, not anyone, while he was alive. He was terrified they'd take his land, but he wanted someone to know in case something happened to him." Elizabeth studied Sarah carefully. "He died 6 months ago. I've been wondering what happened to that property, what happened to what he found." "I found his notes," Sarah said carefully, "and I've seen the chambers. I haven't touched anything, haven't sold anything, but I don't know what to do." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want to do?" "I want to do the right thing," Sarah said honestly. "But I also can't lose this property. It's all I have. It's all my son has. We were homeless before we came here. If the government takes the land, they won't take it," Elizabeth said firmly. "Not if we do this right." She leaned forward. "Those chambers belong to my people's history, but they're on your land. You have a right to be part of the discovery, to be part of preserving them. And if you're willing to work with us, with the tribe, with the right archaeologists, there are grants, funding available for preservation work. You could keep your land, be a caretaker of the site, maybe even receive compensation." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. Hope, maybe. "Really? I can't promise it'll be easy or quick, but yes, really." Elizabeth reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. "Vernon was too afraid to trust the system. I understand why. Our people have been given plenty of reasons not to trust it either. But times are changing. Slowly, but they are. If you're willing to try, I'll help you navigate this. We'll do it right." Sarah looked at her son, happily coloring a picture of the farmhouse he now called home. Then she looked back at Elizabeth and made her decision. "Tell me what we need to do." The next 6 months were complicated, often frustrating, but ultimately transformative. Elizabeth connected Sarah with the right people, archaeologists who specialized in Native American sites, tribal leaders from the Crow Nation, and lawyers who understood both property rights and cultural preservation laws. There were meetings, paperwork, negotiations, and more paperwork. The archaeologists confirmed what Vernon had suspected. The chambers were significant, possibly 800 years old, a ceremonial site that had been used for generations and then carefully sealed, likely when the people who'd built it were forced to move on. The discovery made news, but carefully, with Sarah's privacy protected. Rather than losing her property, she became the official caretaker of the site, receiving a modest but steady income from the tribe and from archaeological grants to maintain and protect it. The farmhouse and most of the acreage remained hers. The area around the chambers became a protected cultural site with access carefully controlled. More than that, Sarah found a purpose. She began working with Elizabeth, learning about the history of the region, helping to document the chambers properly, even taking online courses in archaeological preservation. The tribe welcomed her, grateful that she'd chosen to protect the site rather than exploit it. Money was still tight, but they had enough. The house slowly improved, room by room. Tommy continued to thrive, growing stronger and happier with each passing month. Sarah, for the first time in years, felt like she was building something permanent, something meaningful. It was 18 months after that rainy day in Portland when Sarah sat on the newly repaired porch of the farmhouse, watching Tommy play with two friends from school in the yard. The house gleamed with fresh white paint. The barn had been restored and now housed her workspace and storage for the archaeological project. The fields, still mostly wild, were beautiful in the late summer sun. Elizabeth pulled up in her truck and joined Sarah on the porch, bringing iced tea. The tribe council approved the visitor center proposal, Elizabeth said, settling into the chair beside Sarah. Construction starts next spring. Small, respectful, but it'll bring some tourists to the area. Tell the story properly. And you'll run it if you want the job. I want it, Sarah said immediately. Tommy too. He can help on weekends. He knows the site better than anyone except us. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the children play. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd sold the property? Elizabeth asked. If you'd taken the lawyer's advice? Sarah thought about it. Sometimes. We'd have had a little money for a while. But then what? I'd have been back where I started. No resources, no skills anyone wanted, no future. She gestured to the house, the land, the carefully preserved site just beyond the trees. This is something real, something that matters. Vernon would have been pleased, Elizabeth said. He wanted someone to care for it properly. He just couldn't figure out how to make that happen himself. Fear kept him isolated. I understand that fear, Sarah said. I've lived it, but I also learned something on the streets. Sometimes you have to take a chance, trust someone, ask for help. It's the hardest thing in the world, especially when you've been hurt, but it's the only way forward. Tommy ran up to the porch, breathless and grinning. Mom, can Jake and Maria stay for dinner? Of course, Sarah said, ruffling his hair. He'd grown 3 inches in the past year, was gaining weight. His asthma barely bothered him anymore. He looked like a normal, happy kid, which was all she'd ever wanted for him. After the children ran off again, Elizabeth turned to Sarah. You know, you could write a book about this, or at least tell your story. People need to hear it. About second chances, about preservation, about trust. Sarah smiled. Maybe someday. Right now, I'm just grateful to be here, to have this chance. 1.5 years ago, I was sleeping in doorways with my son. Today, I'm the caretaker of an 800-year-old cultural site. Life is strange. Life is hard, Elizabeth corrected, but also surprising. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, it gives you exactly what you need, exactly when you need it. Sarah looked out at the mountains in the distance, the land she now called home, the history she was helping to preserve, and the future she was building for her son. Yeah, she said softly. Sometimes it does. 5 years later, on a crisp autumn morning, Sarah stood with Tommy, now 11 years old, at the entrance to the visitor center. The building was modest but beautiful, constructed with respect for the landscape and the history it represented. Inside, carefully curated displays told the story of the site, the people who'd built it, and its rediscovery. Tommy had just given his first official tour to a group of high school students from Billings. Sarah watched him with pride as he explained the significance of the pottery designs, the careful construction of the chambers, and the importance of preservation. "He's a natural," Elizabeth said, coming to stand beside Sarah. "You both are." The center had been open for 3 years now, bringing steady income and increasing recognition. Sarah had completed her degree in cultural preservation through an online program. She'd been featured in several articles about ethical site management. The farm was thriving, not as a working farm, but as a living museum and educational center. That evening, after the visitors had gone and Tommy was doing homework at the kitchen table, Sarah walked out to the chambers. She had a key now to the carefully constructed entrance that protected the site while allowing authorized access. She went inside, walking through the familiar passages to the main chamber. She'd spent hundreds of hours here over the years, documenting, preserving, learning. But tonight she just sat in the quiet, remembering. She thought about the desperate woman she'd been, clutching her son under a tattered blanket in Portland rain. She thought about the fear and uncertainty of those first weeks in Montana, living in a truck, not knowing if she'd made a terrible mistake. She thought about the moment she'd opened that metal box in the barn and found hope in the form of hidden cash and a cryptic notebook. And she thought about Vernon Mitchell, the uncle she'd never known, whose fear and secrecy had inadvertently given her this opportunity. She wished she could thank him, tell him that his discovery had done more than he'd ever imagined, not just preserving history, but saving a family. The chambers had stood for 8 centuries, silently holding the stories of people long gone. Now they would stand for centuries more, their story told, their significance recognized, their preservation ensured by an unlikely guardian. A homeless woman who'd inherited an abandoned farm and found something no one expected. Not just artifacts or history, but purpose, community, and a future. Sarah touched the cool stone wall, feeling connected to all the people who'd touched it before. The ones who'd built it, the ones who'd used it for ceremonies and refuge, Vernon who'd discovered and protected it, and now herself carrying it forward. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness, not sure if she was thanking Vernon, or the people who'd built this place, or the universe that had brought her here, or all of them together. The stone offered no answer except its enduring presence, which was answer enough. And so ends the remarkable story of Sarah Mitchell, a homeless mother who inherited an abandoned farm and discovered not just 800-year-old chambers, but a path to redemption and purpose. What would you do if you found yourself with nothing but were given one unexpected chance? Would you have the courage to take it? If this story moved you, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late for a second chance, no matter how dark things seem. Tell me in the comments, do you believe in unexpected second chances? Have you ever had to start over from nothing? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until the next story. And remember, sometimes what looks like an ending is actually a beginning in disguise. Take care.